For those, I think many have seen the videos or you've been in class before, but the quick synopsis of this class is Chris is the every man, every woman, the person with a lot of modern cultural questions and objections to Christianity. Chris is rooted in a real person, and I've taken and adapted a lot of these questions based on things that he, in this case, asked me. And added a few of my own as I've seen more and more discussion and dialogue in the religious world. So today we're going to do Christian exclusivity. We'll go to the next chart. We'll do Christian exclusivity, judgment, and hell. So there are two real questions that we want to address. First of all, the issue of Christian exclusivity. How can you Christians claim you have unique positions on truth? And then the second piece, part B, is the Christian position or the biblical position on God's judgment and hell, and how we can remedy that, or how we understand that as modern folks. And folks who are kind of helping me out, you may have to watch the doors a little bit because we're getting pretty full and we may need to throw another table on, but it's okay for now. All right, so question one, Christian exclusivity. When Rick gets there, he'll flip to this, but basically we'll get it going. I don't think any religion, Chris says, can claim to be uniquely true. Doesn't this narrow exclusivity? Chase, can you help a little bit here? Can you help Rick so that Rick can flip charts? Or flip charts, either one. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We've got a good class, and it's good to have logistics problems. I don't think any religion can claim to be uniquely true. Chris says, doesn't this lead to narrow exclusivity lead to intolerance, division, and war? You heard this one before? Okay? So, good question. First thing I think we ought to do is tell Chris that we have the same concern. Right? I think if we're fair about it, we realize that throughout the ages, religion and Christianity has not been exempted from this because of our passion and our position on unique truth claims. There has been violence. There has been fracture. There has been division. In fact, in some respects, you can say Jesus actually said that would happen. Right? I mean, but I don't think he was as much thinking about the physical aspect of it. But certainly, you don't have to go very far in history to see this dynamic play out. And so we're not going to argue that everything Christopher Hitchens wrote and God is not great is false. Right? I mean, his objections and concerns are concerns that we all share. But if we go to the next chart, I think if we unpack this a little bit, we might come to the conclusion that there are some biases in the question that need to be understood. First of all, let me submit or suggest to you that all belief systems that claim to be true are inherently exclusive. Okay? It's not a question of, some claim to be, some are exclusive and some are not. All are. Now that's a pretty bold statement, so let me see if I can ferret that out a little bit. At face value, particularly in the culture that we live in, Chris's view seems to be very open-minded, right? It is the pluralistic, inclusive kind of view that we typically hear about. Let me suggest to you that that view is what I call absolute non-absolutism, right? And some people have picked this up. You see it. It's not like I invented this. I might have invented the phrase, but not the idea. And absolute non-absolutism only accepts those who agree with it and can be, I suggest, as intolerant and as divisive and as oppressive as any religious system. And this is a point that I think we need to explain or talk through with Chris. Absolute non-absolutism, exclusive non-exclusivism, if you like. And let me give you just a couple of contemporary examples of what I mean when it looks like this. In the beginning, when the tolerance movement began to get digested within Western culture, it seemed very tolerant, very open, very non-judgmental, very non-threatening. All ideas, all beliefs, all viewpoints, equal seems pretty fair, right? But if you remember your high school literature, in the beginning, all animals are created equal. In the end, all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal than others. And that's what's beginning to happen, and we're beginning to see as the tolerance movement becomes more digested, as this view becomes more implemented in the policy of society. First of all, where there is disagreement on core issues such as homosexuality, homosexual marriage, as it becomes more acceptable within society and more indoctrinated into law, you see that those who have fundamental moral objections to it, specifically in business, and there were several cases last year, are being told, you will do this, or we will shut you down, or we will fine you, okay? In other words, if you have an issue of conscience with regard to servicing, photography, flowers, whatever, and I'm not making a judgment on whether one should or should not as a Christian, you will be told by the state, and the state of Washington has told this, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in New Mexico, you will be told you must service the homosexual marriage or pay fines or have your business closed. Okay? Now, we can all have a dialogue about whether that, the legitimacy of that policy, and you can apply it to civil rights and so on and so forth, and it's certainly a good discussion that would probably take all morning. But it is exclusive, non-exclusivism. In other words, if you don't agree, you will be shut down. It is as intolerant as those that it seeks to say must tolerate. Another example, and one that may be close to home for folks, is in the whole area of the homeschooling movement. As you know, there's been quite a bit of work done in the last 30 years in America in homeschooling, but not all countries recognize a parental right to homeschool or choose how their children will be educated. And that's certainly the case in Germany. In Germany, it is illegal to homeschool, and there are a couple of notable instances where parents have tried to take issue with that. There's one, the Wunderlich family, who had their children taken away because they were homeschooling their children, eventually got them back, were seeking last year to move to France where homeschooling is legal, and were blocked by the court. And the basis of the blocking by the court didn't have anything to do with whether they thought it would be, the kids would grow up smart enough. It came down to a statement that the children would grow up, if they were homeschooled, in a parallel society without having learned to be integrated or to have dialogue with those who think differently and facing them in a sense of practicing tolerance. He said in the court order that homeschooling creates concrete endangerment to the well-being of the child. In other words, you need to be, for lack of a better term, indoctrinated into the worldview. And if you choose an avenue which may not lead to that indoctrination, we will not accept that. A rather intolerant perspective, in my judgment. A little closer to home are and I don't know if I'm saying this right, the Ramekis. They actually fled Germany and came to the United States and were seeking and were initially granted asylum in order to be able to homeschool their children. And then that asylum was overturned, and it was overturned in part by the arguments from our Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, which stated that German's law, we needed to uphold German's law to bring people of differing views together to learn from each other and to learn to accept those whose views differ from their own. And it kind of praised the goal of the open, pluralistic society that Germany was trying to inculcate. Now, I don't think the dichotomy is lost on folks, right? I don't think the irony is lost. Today, and just continuing to camp out on homeschooling just for a minute, not because I believe you have to homeschool or anything, that's not my point at all. I don't believe that. But clearly, the education of the next generation is very fundamental to any belief system getting integrated into society. That just is, right? And it's been stated, John Dunphy, who was a famous humanist who was part of writing the Humanist Manifesto Part 2 in 1973, said, "I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their roles as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. The classroom must and will become an area of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved." So he clearly understood, as Dewey had 40 years before him, that, what happens in the classroom is fundamental. The argument anymore against children not being schooled in a certain manner ultimately doesn't have to do with whether they'll do well in college, because they do, or whether they can integrate and speak to adults, because they do. The argument now has shifted to they aren't tolerant, pluralistic, open-minded, sensitive enough to cultural differences. In other words, you need to think the way we think. It is absolute, not absolutism. So my argument is not to beat up or to get into a long debate about this. It's to point out the irony and actually the truth that any non-exclusive belief system, you won't find it. So we shouldn't try. Instead, what we ought to do is look at the belief system that best addresses humanity's problems, and I'll talk about that in a second. Let's go to the next chart, which is the second part of his comment, which is that human violence comes from religious belief. Well, I don't think we have to go very far to see that religious belief spawns, in many cases, human violence. It's true. Okay? I don't think we would argue that. But so does anything else that divides humanity, including sporting events, right? If you've ever watched YouTube videos of hooligans in soccer, or even the most, and I realize these are a little bit one-off cases, but what's the latest one? The University of Alabama fan that shot his friend in the living room because he wasn't passionate enough about the Auburn loss. Now, I'm sure there was alcohol involved, and when you see these kinds of things, but anything people are passionate about, religion, non-religion, what have you, I suggest people will eventually divide over, and in some cases, many cases, they will become violent over. So the question is not as problematically focused as Hitchens would have us believe exclusively on religion. This seems to be a more transcendent problem to me. And one of the more ironic things about it is that the greatest violence against humanity in recent times, in the 20th century, came out of atheistic regimes that suppressed or controlled all religion. We're familiar with this. We know the history of Nazi Germany. We know Maoist China. We know Stalinist Russia. We know Pol Pot in Cambodia. No short of 100 million people in these regimes were killed by their own leaders. The historian and theologian Alistair McGrath says the 20th century gave rise to one of the greatest and most distressing paradoxes of human history, that the greatest intolerance and violence of that century were practiced by those that believed that religion caused intolerance and violence. Now, if you read, to be fair, many of the atheist camp or skeptics will say that because something happened in that society did not mean that it was caused by atheism. It was not caused necessarily by the absence of religious belief. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, if you're into logic. Just because something followed does not mean it was caused by. Even if we granted that, and I think that's speculative. I read one fellow who said that the reason for the Maoist genocide was incompetence. That's a large number of people to die from incompetence. But be that as it may, however you wish to kind of sugarcoat it, the fact is it didn't come from religion. religion was suppressed. Religion was controlled by the state. So if you like to accept Kitchen's argument that religion poisons everything, the question is, what happened in these very obvious and recent experiences where religion couldn't have controlled everything? What's the problem? And I would suggest that the problem is not religion or non-religion or sports or non-sports or any of this sort of thing, and therefore the answer to the problem, unlike what we read from the gentleman before, is not to eliminate religion, not to eradicate religion, but to find the belief system that best addresses humanity's true problem. What is humanity's true problem? I suggest to you it's this. Ever since the first division over Abel offering spoils to God and Cain murdering him out of jealousy, we have murdered one another out of all kinds of areas of division. Preference, religion, ideology, philosophy, ethnic differences, what have you. What's the common denominator? It's humanity. Humanity, more specifically the sin within the human heart, is the problem, not the systems which it utilizes in order to be able to execute that sin. So if we go to the next chart, I would suggest that Christianity is the religion which addresses the real problem of humanity, even in its own followers. Even in its own followers. First of all, Christianity is honest, brutally honest, about the existence, the seriousness, and the spread of evil. Right? We may not be able to answer every single jot and tittle about the origin of evil, but it is very clear that the Bible speaks to the existence of evil and how evil has penetrated all of humanity. There's a big problem, and Christianity is very clear about the existence and spread of evil, ever since the first murder all the way to all of the murders, genocides, oppressions, persecutions, etc., that have happened since. I would also suggest that Christianity is honest about the violence of humanity. The Bible does not sugarcoat violence. It is pretty clear that there is quite a bit of violence which spawns from a number of different reasons. I'll let you kind of work through, but I think we can come up with 5 or 6 examples right off the top of our head. The violence of humanity is pretty clear throughout the Bible. Christianity is also honest about the misuse of religion even amongst its own followers. Okay? First of all, it's very honest about the misuse of religion amongst the Jews. When Jesus came, he was oppressed and persecuted not because he was not a law keeper, but because he did keep the law, but he didn't keep the laws which the Jews had implemented, the laws upon laws, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. Might be. There was misuse of religion for personal preference, for personal gain. There was misuse of religion in order to be able to implement power. The Bible is pretty clear about that. The greatest misuse of religion was to take and eventually persecute and kill Jesus Christ as a function of, on a religious basis, of his claims. But the Bible is also clear about the misuse of religion amongst its followers. And Matt gave the illustration last week about James and John as they're following along with Jesus. They go through Samaria, and the Samaritans do not welcome them, and they say, go that way, don't go this way. And James and John would like to use their newfound power of the Messiah to call down fire from heaven. Right? And we have called down fire from heaven from time to time over the years, so to speak, in terms of implementing our Christian belief system. So Christianity is honest about the misuse of religion even amongst its followers. Christianity is also honest about the fallibility of its followers. One of the arguments that the neo-atheists use today is Lot, sleeping with daughters, the bad behavior of a David, basically all of this bad stuff that the leaders, biblical leaders, do. That's the point, right? The point is that we have this corruption innate within us. And the Bible doesn't try to, put these people on pedestals and make them saints. It talks about the doubts of Moses. It talks about the willingness of Abraham to sell out his wife. It talks about Peter and his lack of courage. I mean, it's over and over and over again. You see the failings of the followers and the fallibility of the followers. And that's the point. Christianity is honest about the need for a real solution to the real problem, which is the heart, which is the sin which has permeated us as people, and no matter what we choose to pick, we will find some basis of division and some reason for us to fight one another over it. It also offers the real solution in the person of Christ, in the redemptive power of God, and in God's provision to be able to address the problem, even as we are in the process of that problem being addressed. So as, to quote Chesterton in his famous quote, you know this one, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting, it has been found difficult and not tried. That's a little snarky, but you know what his point is. It's not the model, it's not the problem. God's solution is not the problem. It's not the system that's the problem, as this gentleman said, as Dunphy said. The issue is us as we work through the process of sanctification and bring forth the kingdom into the world. Now, I would close this section just simply by, we could say a lot more, but I would close this section by going back to what Dunphy said in 1973, which was nothing more than a continuation of things that had been taught for decades before. And he says, rotting corpse of Christianity, adjacent evils and misery, new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world which the never realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved. Well, that was 40 years ago. Okay? How's it working? How's it going? That's my question. If Christianity was old and obsolete and rotted and so on and so forth, it's not the dominant worldview anymore. I would suggest that Mr. Dunphy, Dr. Dunphy, whatever, John Dunphy, his worldview is the dominant worldview and has been for some time. How are we doing? So I think that's the question we should ask Chris. So let me stop here. That's actually where I want to start with judgment. So Chris is asking the question on the next chart. I don't believe in a God of judgment. If he is God, he wouldn't be so insecure as to cast down wrath on those who don't agree with him. And how could a loving God ever send anyone to a hell of everlasting torment? Good questions, right? Good, hard stuff. At least we're not avoiding the hard questions in our class, right? We may not have great answers. All right, next chart. Let me suggest, first of all, that we as a people have an innate sense of justice and judgment built into our human hearts. Our scale changes from time to time, and all the time, but the concept of justice is fundamental to every society and to every belief system. There was if you got the email that I sent out and you happened to watch that R.C. Sproul video that I sent, maybe some of you did, he makes the joke about how, moderns say that there is no such thing as good and evil until someone steals their wallet, and then they run and try to find the cop, right? You don't have to go too far. We mentioned the Trayvon Martin instance last year, that whole case where there was such a passionate cry for justice on quote-unquote both sides of the aisle. So those who felt injustice had been done, those who felt justice had been upheld. And there's no absence of the call for justice within our society and amongst our people today. And there's no absence of call for judgment. So the first thing that we should do is appreciate that, Chris, we all are looking for judgment. We all have a sense of justice, and the reason we submit as Christians that we do is because it's one of the areas in which we're image bearers. God God is a God of justice and judgment. He has established standards or rules or laws. We see a template of them in the Mosaic covenant. And so we as image bearers, imperfect as we are, believe in justice. But here's, somewhat, I'll admit, a little cynical view, is we want it on our terms, right? We want justice, but we want justice on our terms, and we want them according basically to our standards, specifically our cultural standards. Now, there's always going to be some of that, but I think everybody probably understands the challenge that you have, because as cultural standards change, so our elements of justice change, and the question ultimately is it right or is it wrong, right? If there is no North Star to guide us. Paul Kurtz was a famous humanist. He participated in writing the Humanist Manifesto Part 2 and a lot of Prometheus books and a lot of stuff that was kind of the cutting edge of neo-atheism. And he recognized the problem. He said, on the scale of human values, which have higher priorities, my needs or interests or yours, if it's a sliding scale? And those are his words. This is the underlying problem, I submit. We can adopt a moral standard. This is my opinion. However, unless the other party adopts the same standard, there's going to be a conflict, and the idea of shared enjoyment, which is fundamental to that perspective, may not come to pass. He goes on to say how he resolves the problem, and these are direct quotes. There is, in my judgment, no ultimate resolution of this problem, no deductive proof of the moral point of view. It seems to me that some constructive skepticism is a necessary component of moral philosophy, although a reflective person will in general come to abide by the moral point of view. It is not universally binding. He goes on to say, humanist philosophers have recognized that our ultimate obligation in final analysis is the use of rational thought to resolve as best we can such moral dilemmas. We will decide to do, as I have said, what we decide to do, as I have said, presupposes some moral education and a sensitivity to general ethical principles, an important concomitant of humanistic ethics. Still, the autonomous person, capable of reflective choice, is his own best guide. Now, that sounds pretty good, but I think it's just kind of gibberish, candidly. It's somebody wrestling with a very unsolvable problem, which is ultimately, if my standards and your standards are different, and my sense of justice and your sense of justice are different in a relativistic view, what's right, what prevails, what's better, what's worse? Now, what Kurtz would say is religion is not the answer, right? So, to be fair. But you see this a little bit with regard to the evolution in terms of understanding of civil rights. And I've noticed, as posts have been on Facebook, sometimes when people go back and say, well, that's the way it was, if you look at, this film 42 or something like that, someone says, well, that's the way it was, people will jump on that immediately and say it never should have been. I think that's probably a fair statement. It never should have been, but it was. And if you adopt a cultural relative view in terms of what defines right, wrong, truth, standards, and justice, it's pretty hard to argue against that. That that's the way it was then, and this is the way it is today, and it was right then, and it's wrong today. Well, I don't think most people believe that. I think most people in this room and society believe it was wrong then and it's wrong now, right? That the way in which the whole 42 experience, if you know what I mean, the Jackie Robinson feel, right? That was wrong behavior then, and it's wrong behavior now. Well, that's exactly right. That's the issue. There's an absolute view, and so the sliding scale of justice that we try to sometimes implement is very untenable, because our cultural beliefs ultimately are very relative and ultimately subject to error. It was the challenge that when Greg Bahnsen would debate atheists, he would ask the question, well, if your view is correct, was Hitler right because the dominant cultural view at the time was the Aryan nation? That's a very hard answer for somebody to come back and say, yeah, that was just the culture at the time, right? So here is the problem. It's not an absence of justice, it's the question of where that justice comes course, we would subscribe that the ultimate basis of justice are biblical standards. And the problem, of course, within our society is that when biblical standards and cultural standards collide, what humanity tends to do, and we're all a little guilty of this, all of us, is we tend to redefine God as the senile, benevolent grandfather. And we talked about this last week. C.S. Lewis's statement that God becomes kind of this passive, watching people come in, blow up firecrackers on the street, come in and, mark up his house and desecrate his creation, and he just kind of sits there on the rocking chair and says, you shouldn't do that. And it's very, because he's loving, quote unquote. And we hear that a God of love wouldn't judge. But what I think the translation of that is, and I'm not trying to be too cynical, but what I think the translation of it is that a God of love would allow us to make the rules as we see fit, on a sliding scale based on what we believe we can keep. And so as some have pointed out, even those in prison look down upon other prisoners, well, those are the pedophiles over there, the bad people, the bad prisoners. I'm in prison for, a not as bad thing. And it all becomes very relative, okay? A God of love, ultimately, in our judgment, would let us make the rules, and rules, although, by the way, would generally accommodate us. So if the worst thing that we ever did in life was to cheat on our taxes, a God of love would not judge, or he would just kind of say, cheat on the taxes. If we were a little bit worse and we'd actually cheated on our spouse, then he would say, well, you really shouldn't have done that, but, a lot of people do it nowadays, and so it's good. And you kind of have this sliding scale, right, of what you get in and what you get out based on God being a God of love. Well, as Mark pointed out, and as Tim Keller has pointed out, and C.S. Lewis has pointed out, that's not love at all. Right? It's not love at all. So let me suggest, if you go to the next chart, that the imagery that we need to capture in part, in addition to and complementing many of the things that you guys were talking about earlier, is that God is the warrior king. He's not the senile benevolent grandfather. And the archetype, just to kind of put it in human terms, that I'd like to offer you is someone like a David, if you picture a David or an Aragorn, even if you like a Lincoln, who was passionate about his kingdom, passionate about his people, passionate about that which had been entrusted to him, passionate, and loved deeply. You imagine the love that David had, even when his son betrayed him, crying out when his son died, the love that he had for his people, for his kingdom, the love, if you like, that Lincoln showed to the Union, the desire to keep the Constitution, depending on your view on that. I know there's a lot, right? But by the same token, fierce wrath that those people simultaneously executed upon their enemies. We don't have a problem with that tension when we put it in that context, do we? We can see David loving his people, loving God, loving, and at the same time going out into battle. That's not a hard contradiction in terms for us, I don't think. We can see it in a, Lord of the Rings kind of Aragorn kind of archetype. The problem that we have in seeing it in God is a complete view of love, which, as Mark alluded to, over my dead body, right? As Tim Keller pointed out, if you saw injury being done to the person that you loved, to a person that you were passionate about, you would not love by sitting back and saying, we'll see how this whole thing plays out. Right? That's not love. There is a fierce anger associated with a violation that's done when it's done against your property, when it's done against your children, when it's done against your stuff. Think how much more upon God's masterpiece. So the issue I think we are challenged with, and what we need to work through with Chris, is the whole notion that God has enemies. Now, this is not a popular view, but it is a very biblical view. It's not hard for us to find that the statement that God has enemies in the Scripture. Mark Dever wrote a book or a paper, Does God Have Enemies? He used the study of Obadiah, and basically the conclusion was the proud and self-sufficient. You can write down Psalm 68, 1 and 21, Romans 5:10, Colossians 1:21, Hebrews 10:27, fearful expectation of the fire that will consume the enemies of God. And Paul's reminder that when we were yet enemies, Christ died for us. And his recognition that once you were aliens and strangers and enemies because of your sinful behavior, but now because of the great love which he has showered upon you, right? There's this sense of enemies. Isaiah 63. I was wondering if anyone would get there. I've only heard in 30 years of attending church it exposited one time because it's a hard passage. But it's so true. Who is this coming from Edom? Edom, the enemy of Israel, representative of the enemies of God. From Bozrah with his garments stained crimson. Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength? It is I proclaiming victory, mighty to save. Why are your garments red like those of one treading the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone. From the nations no one was with me. I trampled them in my anger and trod them down in my wrath. The blood spattered my garments, and I stained all my clothing. It was for me the day of vengeance, the day to redeem had come. I looked, and there was no one to help. I was appalled that no one gave support. So my own arm achieved salvation for me, and my own wrath sustained me. I trampled the nations in anger. In my wrath, I made them drunk, and poured the blood on the ground. This is the imagery of the wrath of God that comes upon his enemies. As fierce and as passionate as his love, so as fierce and as passionate is his anger against those who would transgress his creation and violate his people. And that's the tension that we have to live in. And although not easy, it's also what we need to offer Chris, because if this stuff is not real, then there's no way in which we can have any discussion whatsoever about an idea called hell, right? And if you go to the next chart, hell, and many will remind me that, hell is translated, the word Sheol or Hades or Gehenna is translated into hell there. But Gehenna specifically, the idea that you have in terms of this fire, the eternal conscience, the misery reserved from the enemies of God is about 9 or 11 times, I can't remember. Most notably in Luke 16 in the parable with Lazarus and the beggar, Lazarus the beggar and the rich man. But Jesus teaches about it substantially, and that is the Gehenna term, right? That is the fire that was always burning. That was the garbage dump outside the city that was always burning. And it was always the warning that Jesus, gave. The worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. The subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I will show you who you shall fear. Fear him who after the killing of the body has power to throw you into hell. Fear him. So Jesus took it very seriously. And it naturally follows because there is a severe consequence for the violation of God's creation. Now, because this is not a popular topic today, we've done some things theologically. We've introduced to some degree the doctrine of annihilation, and there's some discussion there that should be had, I think. We've kind of made hell maybe not so bad in as much as we have suggested, and I think there's truth to this, that it's really the continued trajectory of human depravity. It's basically God saying, you want to go there, go there. Have at it. I'm removing my common grace and I'm letting you go do what your thing is. And it's going to get ugly and you're going to be as wicked as you possibly can because I'm basically removing my goodness that I've bestowed upon all my creation. And there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I think generally understood that, the flames are a metaphor, right, for agony, for misery, for, severe discomfort. The question, of course, is why would God not just eradicate? Why didn't he just destroy? Why didn't he just eliminate? That's a very hard question, right? I could speculate. I could speculate that God, once he creates, will not destroy his creation. When Jesus talks about eternal life, he's not talking, about the fact that people will not have eternal life. People are going to have eternal life. The question is where? With him or not with him? The other thing that we struggle with, candidly, and it's very hard for anybody to even get a mind around, is that eternity is not a time, it's a state. It's a state of being. We talk about, and this is the best we could do, and I've been there 10,000 years, blah, 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 blah. Well, there's no 10,000 years, right? There's no 0 years, there's no 1 year, there's no 10,000 years, there's no infinite, it just is. It's a state of existence. And obviously as finite creatures, we have a very hard time getting our minds around that. But the Bible is very clear, and the Bible is very clear about it, not because, it's trying to be mean and all this sort of thing, but because it's trying to identify how serious evil is to God and how serious the consequence of evil is for God, and by extension, how serious and how passionate the love of God is for his people who he has come to deliver through his Son, Jesus Christ. Because if hell is not really that bad, or not really that real, or if God were just going to, well, you've had a pretty bad life, you're done, the cross is not very, very significant. You know what I mean? The love that he has shown to deliver his people, all those stories that we just talked about, is not really very significant. He's not really rescuing us from anything. So I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm not trying to make it easy. I don't think it's even supposed to be easy. But the less serious we take the consequences of sin, the less serious we take the idea of love. And if we're going to talk about cross-shaped things, the backdrop of the cross is what? Wrath. It's the wrath that God is saving us from. And if that wrath is not real, and if it's not severe, and if it's not significant, then the love that he has shown by delivering his Son to rescue us from that wrath is not real, not very significant, and not very relevant. And candidly, that is where we are, right? Jesus is a good guy, good moral teaching, but the salvation that we talk about, the good news of the gospel, is really not very much good news because the backdrop of the gospel is just blah, right? So part of the good news of the Christian message, as difficult as it is the fact that Jesus delivered us from that wrath. And that wrath is just, and it's severe, and there is an anger that is associated with the love of God in order to be able to preserve his creation. And so maybe as you kind of go through and minister and Chris in this area through prayer and through discussion and so on and so forth, the takeaways would be, as much as God loves, God must also be angry with sin. It's his nature. And as much as God is angry with sin, he has shown forth to deliver his people from those consequences by the great display of Jesus Christ. And so it really ought to get our spiritual juices flowing, so to speak, to get excited about who the Savior is. Right? Okay, let's stop. I've gone over. What questions do you have?